Hi everyone, so today we're going to be talking about some of the common reasons developers give for not wanting to embrace a you build it, you run it operating model. And crucially, what you can do to help overcome some of those reservations. So there's a couple of reasons I want to touch on this topic. Let's just get into it. I've read quite a few articles recently suggesting that developers don't want or shouldn't want to be responsible for operations. And we all know that that change is hard, and often people and teams can be resistant to it. So when I talk to teams about changing operating models, it's common to experience some initial resistance. The reality is that the business benefits for you build it, you run it on digital services are huge. So from a management perspective, there are some crucial things that you can do to understand and respond to those concerns and ensure that your team has the best chance to embrace you build it, you run it. In turn, that will ensure you can access the benefits of you build it, you run it, particularly things like faster speed to market, and improved service reliability, even happier development teams, and much more value for your customers. So this video will look at some of the reasons I have heard about why developers don't want to do you build it, you run it, and ways in which you can alleviate those concerns. Let's get to it. So when development teams say that a service is difficult to support, it's often a symptom of a couple of deeper potential issues. The first is that the service hasn't been architected for adaptability, so it is in fact difficult to support. The second is they don't have paved roads in place, and this means the development team has to do everything that's associated with operating the service, from running the deployment pipelines, running the cloud underneath the service, the whole shebang. And in that scenario, it can become quite overwhelming, and that cognitive load can become enormous. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on paved roads because you can read more about this in our digital platforms playbook. In summary, building paved roads is about removing friction from common processes or user journeys that are specific for engineering teams. And this allows you to abstract problems away from one development team to allow them to focus more exclusively on their role in relation to building specific services for end customers. Generally speaking, you can consider paved roads in relation to four broad categories. Firstly, build and deployment. How do I build, deploy, and get a service out of production? Secondly, the telemetry. How do I monitor, log, and alert on a given service? Thirdly, the enablement. How do I create a service in the first place? And how do I manage the cloud that's underneath it for resiliency? And lastly, things like user access and security controls. If I created these paved roads, when I get to multiple delivery teams, which is particularly relevant at scale, these paved roads themselves are managed by a platform capabilities team. And that team builds and runs the paved road itself, freeing the service team to focus on the development and operations of that service alone. I also mentioned that a reason is that the service hasn't been architected for adaptability. And what I mean by this is that the product team structure and also the service themselves were designed in a way that coupled both the services and the teams together, making it really difficult for you to adapt and change the service when things are not working or when you want to make new changes to it. There are multiple ways you can go about ensuring you can architect for adaptability. And a few of those reasons are looking at avoiding dependencies between services. And if you can't avoid dependencies, look at ways to soften them as much as possible. Also look at ways that you can create an architecture that is highly reliable, meaning that you won't have that issues in the first place. Think about setting up the team ownership for a given service, making sure that one team is responsible for that service. And look at things like shuttering a service to make sure we can reduce the impact when you have an incident. To find out more about how you can architect your services for adaptability, have a look at my video on how to architect your service to make sure it's easily adaptable. The second reason that I hear is that we don't want to work on support out of hours. And here we really need to understand why the architecture isn't built in a way that forces people to work out of hours. Because it's enormously important to understand so that we can re-architect the service to fix this situation. It's also about understanding the personal circumstances of the people in your team. They could not have the skills or feel supported to do out of hours support. They could be caring for family members, or they could even have another job because they're not being paid enough to complete this type of support work. Having a look at these reasons, make sure you can understand why it is people don't want to work and support out of hours. So there are two courses of action to take in response to this concern. The firstly is about understanding and really empathising with people's personal circumstances. And secondly, about analysing the service, determine whether out-of-hours support is entirely necessary. Because in my experience, in most cases it's not. This is because many organisations actually mistakenly take a blanket approach to operations, rather than selecting an operating model based on the actual availability requirements of the service. More often than not, businesses assume a service has a requirement of 99.9% availability, and people wrongly assume that we need this service available all night, and developers are unnecessarily supporting those services out of hours. There are ways to test that assumption and determine the real availability requirements of a service. With less requirement for out-of-hours support, you'll have less requirement for developers to do this type of work, and of course, less cause for concern. You can learn more about availability assessments in my other videos, and also find relevant links in the description below. The third reason I hear is that developers are saying that they won't get remunerated properly. And it's common that developers are asked to work out of hours or work on support and they're not getting paid for it. And a common thing I see is that they could get time off in lieu instead. But if they're not given the time to be able to take that time in lieu, because their time is backed up with this requirement to get more features out, then you become in a vicious cycle. You get trapped in getting more features out to support the service, and because you've got more features out, you've got more of a service to support. There's also no real time to take that time off within that cycle. So from the developer's perspective, there's no respite and there's no remuneration. This pressure to deliver new features can come from a range of sources. Perhaps they're not delivering frequently and iteratively enough. Or perhaps there's pressure to develop features rather than ensuring reliability of service. Or that there's an appropriate analysis of where the most value lies, resulting in you being caught in the bill trap. Have a look at a great book by Melissa Perry called Escaping the Bill Trap, where you can find out more about this. So how do we fix this? Firstly, to fix this, we need to get out of the ever-ending cycle of just building. Instead, what we can do is have a look at making the product manager accountable for both the building and the running of the service, ensuring that there is a clear priority call being made between working on things that improve reliability compared to working on new features, and value is attributed to both. Have a look at taking a look upstream of the development team. Follow some of the tips from Melissa Perry's book, where you can ensure that you are not only building something the right way, but you are actually building the right thing in the first place. And thirdly, ensure that you've selected the right availability target for your service. Once you know the correct level of service you need to maintain, make sure you look at remunerating your team effectively for when they're on those out-of-hours calls. Pay them for the disruption that it's causing to their lives. And lastly, ensure that you've got a sustainable on-call schedule that makes sure that there is a balance between keeping the reliability of the service and the lives of your team members. The fourth thing I hear is we just want to build new features and focus on development work only. I actually don't hear this statement being said a lot, and I don't see it really being expressed in the reality of working with development teams. But if we do encounter this statement, I'd be looking at the team's motivations, and particularly how they can view the problem they've been tasked to look at solving. Think about reframing the problem so that they're not inheriting an ops, they're focused on rebuilding a service so that it's more robust and reliable, with a number of contingencies in place to make sure that we can mitigate the need for those onerous ops tasks. Give them more of an outcome that they want to achieve rather than a direct output or task to do. And all of this really helps the team understand why they're being asked to do something. It's one thing to tell a team we're implementing a you build it, you run it operating model and you should run your service, but it's another thing to implement all of the supporting mechanism structures that really allow them to flourish in that new operating model. And I often see teams being told to support a service, but without being appropriately supported themselves. And they're not given the things that allow them to be able to flourish and get the benefits out of you build it, you run it. So to recap, those things are a service that's architected for adaptability and that it's supported by paved roads when at scale. Having a look at a thorough assessment as to whether services generally require an out-of-hours support. Making sure that you've got appropriate remuneration for that out-of-hours support for your team. And being much more outcome focused rather than output focused to make sure that people understand why they know what they're delivering. As always, if you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel for more on You Build It, You Run It. Or follow some of the links in the description below to see more content from me. See you again soon.